Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. Should global maritime disputes be governed by the logic of modern, codified international law or by the historical realities of civilizational continuity and strategic defense? Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description.
Yeah, and to set the scene a bit, just imagine standing on an ancient, pristine coral reef in the middle of the open ocean. For thousands of years, it's just sea turtles and, the occasional wooden fishing boat.
Right.
But suddenly, an industrial fleet arrives. They drop these massive mechanical cutter heads to the seafloor, grind up millions of tons of sand and living coral, and just pump that thick slurry right onto the reef, burying it completely.
And then they pave over it to build a 3,000-meter concrete runway? One that can actually launch nuclear bombers? I mean, it sounds like a scene from a dystopian novel, but it is a physical reality happening right now in the South China Sea.
Exactly. And this isn't just some remote corner of the globe. This geographic space is, without exaggeration, the functional heart of the global economy. I mean, roughly 1/3 of all global maritime trade flows through these waters.
Not to mention the vast, largely untapped reserves of oil and natural gas beneath the seabed. But as our source dossier for today reveals, the South China Sea, which encompasses the contested Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, and Scarborough Shoal, is far more than just a shipping lane or a resource basin. It is the focal point of a completely irreconcilable clash of logics.
Right. It's a collision course. Two entirely different ways of understanding how the world actually works.
Which brings us to the core of the debate. Let me state my position clearly right at the start. I argue that the modern international legal framework, specifically codified rules, is the only legitimate and stable mechanism for resolving territorial disputes and preventing unilateral expansion.
And I take the opposing view. My position is that codified international law is this retrospectively applied system. It structurally fails to account for profound historical continuity, and it basically ignores the legitimate sovereign security imperatives of a major regional power.
So let's unpack the architecture of what we are actually talking about here. If you are a country in Southeast Asia, say the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, or Brunei, your entire conceptual framework relies on a document called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS.
Right. Universally known as UNCLOS.
Exactly. And this isn't just some polite gentleman's agreement. It is effectively the constitution of the oceans. It establishes a very precise geometric rule, which is that a coastal state gets a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, an EEZ.
Right.
So you draw a 200-mile circle off your coast, and within that specific zone, your state has the exclusive sovereign right to fish, to drill for oil, and to exploit natural resources.
But see, the problem with that geometric circle is that it fundamentally ignores what was there before the ink dried on that convention in the late 20th century.
Well, I wouldn't say it ignores it. I'd say it standardizes it, so countries don't go to war. Think of this legal framework like a civic property line in a neighborhood. Without a universally agreed-upon codified deed, which is what UNCLOS provides, regional stability defaults to a predatory system.
A predatory system?
Yes, because without a deed, the largest, most powerful neighbor simply redraws the fences at will. They claim the entire neighborhood based on the fact that their ancestors used to walk across it.
I understand the appeal of the neighborhood property line analogy, I really do. But it assumes everyone agreed to buy into the exact same neighborhood association at the exact same time, under rules they all wrote together.
Which they did ratify, ultimately.
Yes, eventually. But let's look at the actual foundation of China's claims here. It's grounded in a deep, heavily documented history of usage, imperial dynasty mapping, and continuous civilizational presence. We are talking about centuries of navigators, fishermen, and administrative awareness in those waters.
Sure, but
Just to visualize it for the listener, the Republic of China published the famous 9-dash line map in 1947. This is a giant U-shaped line swooping all the way down near the coast of Malaysia, encompassing roughly 90% of the South China Sea.
right, a line that cuts directly through the 200-mile EEZs of almost every other country in the region.
Yes, but the People's Republic inherited that claim in 1949. That was decades before UN close was even conceptualized, let alone finalized. I mean, UN close didn't come into force until 1994. So from the perspective of historical logic, these historic rights existed well before the modern framework was universally codified.
But UN close has incredibly specific rules about what actually constitutes land. You know, a rock that sits above water at high tide but cannot sustain human habitation or an economic life of its own only gets a 12-mile territorial sea. It does not get a 200-mile EEZ.
Right, that's the legal text.
And you certainly cannot build a sovereign claim out of artificially dredged sand, which was the exact crux of the landmark 2016 arbitration tribunal initiated by the Philippines. The tribunal looked at the features China was claiming and legally invalidated them, declaring them just rocks or low-tide elevations that do not generate massive sovereign zones.
Okay, but when you bring up that 2016 arbitration tribunal, the fundamental counter-argument from Beijing and from legal scholars who view this through a sovereignty lens is that the tribunal fundamentally lacked jurisdiction.
Wait, how can a UN-backed tribunal lack jurisdiction over the law of the sea? That doesn't make sense.
Because UN close is designed to govern maritime entitlements. It dictates what kinds of water zones generate from a piece of coastline. It is explicitly not designed to rule on the sovereign ownership of the underlying land features themselves.
Ah, I see the distinction you're making.
Right. The core dispute in the South China Sea is fundamentally about who holds sovereignty over those rocks, reefs, and islands. Because UN close does not govern territorial sovereignty, applying a maritime treaty to erase a nation's historical territorial rights is seen as legally inappropriate and historically blind.
But if we follow that historical logic to its natural conclusion, we are looking at a recipe for absolute global anarchy. I mean, if we accept that historical mapping and ancient administrative awareness form a valid basis for rewriting modern sovereignty, where does that process actually end?
Well, it doesn't mean every ancient map in a museum is, suddenly binding international law. It means
Structurally, though, it opens that exact door. What if the historical colonial claims from the European powers were suddenly reactivated? France exerted colonial authority over islands in this exact region when it occupied Vietnam.
that's a very different context.
Is it? After World War II, Japan left a massive power vacuum in the maritime territories it violently occupied. If every modern nation decided to reach back into the archives, pick their preferred century of maximum imperial expansion, and overlay those historical maps onto the 21st century, the global map descends into chaos. We operate on what political scientists call the Westphalian concept of borders.
Right. Hard boundaries.
Yes, the idea that a country has hard, permanent, legally recognized borders drawn on a map, not fluid, shifting frontiers based on ancient influence. How can centuries-old navigation records logically supersede a modern negotiated treaty that China itself actively signed and ratified?
I come at it from a completely different direction.
Go ahead.
To dismiss centuries of uninterrupted civilizational presence simply because it doesn't fit neatly into a mid-20th century legal construct is, frankly, a form of Western legal chauvinism. We have to look honestly at how international law was constructed.
Okay.
It was largely authored and heavily influenced by Western powers, who had already secured their global maritime dominance. They wrote a rule book that effectively froze the geopolitical status quo at a moment in time that was highly advantageous to them.
But let's be accurate about the history of UN clause here. The developing nations, including the Southeast Asian states we are talking about today, were heavily involved in the decades-long drafting of that convention.
They were at the table, sure.
They fought for the 200-mile EEZ precisely to protect themselves from the maritime empires you're talking about.
They were involved, yes, but the underlying conceptual framework, this idea that you can neatly slice the ocean into geometric buffers and completely separate land sovereignty from maritime history, that is an entirely modern invention. China's position possesses immense civilizational continuity.
Right.
To them, the South China Sea wasn't just a blank blue space on a map waiting for a United Nations committee to assign it coordinates. It was an integrated, organic part of a civilizational sphere of influence. The legal position you are defending is struggling to enforce itself against major powers exactly because it attempts to retroactively legislate away the historical weight of a civilization
that has operated in those waters for over a millennium. You cannot draw a line in 1994 and pretend the previous 1,000 years didn't happen.
I concede that international law is a modern invention, but that is entirely the point. The very purpose of international law is to create a deliberate break from the violent, expansionist history of the past. If we don't standardize state behavior with these modern inventions, we are just left with the physical realities of coercion. And I want to pivot here, because historical claims aren't self-enforcing. If you believe your civilization owns a maritime space, but the international community legally does not recognize it, your only recourse is to physically occupy it to make it a reality.
Which brings us to the militarization of the features.
Exactly. Let's move from abstract legal theory to the physical reality of strategic defense, because there is a direct, undeniable causal link between this legal ambiguity and physical escalation.
Okay, lay out the link.
When a major power relies on an amorphous historical right rather than a codified boundary, it requires physical force to assert it. We saw this back in 1974 when China violently seized the Paracel Islands from Vietnam.
Right.
We saw it in the 1988 naval clash in the Spratlys. And today, we see it in the unprecedented engineering of these artificial islands I described at the top of the show.
Which, just to be clear for the listener, involves taking submerged reefs and building them into fully functioning facilities above the waterline.
Right. The sheer scale of the dredging is staggering. They are creating land where none existed. And they aren't building environmental research stations. They are building deepwater ports, radar installations, and missile silos. Analysts routinely describe these outposts as unsinkable aircraft carriers. The logic here is unavoidable. These massive installations are not defensive in nature. They are a coercive mechanism designed to unilaterally alter the status quo. By projecting military power deep across the sea, a single nation can dictate maritime traffic, monopolize the hydrocarbon resources beneath the seabed, and routinely intimidate smaller nations like the Philippines entirely out of their legally recognized EEZs. The physical reality of these military bases proves that the historical logic is ultimately just a convenient narrative cover for modern territorial expansion.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Let's pause on the unsinkable aircraft carriers concept for a second, because you are looking at those island installations entirely through the lens of an external actor. You are assuming the natural default state of the world is American maritime dominance. We need to look at this through a strategic concept often referred to as the blue national territory.
Okay.
Does China view the ocean the exact same way it views a landmass like Beijing? In many strategic ways, yes. For a nation of China's immense size and its profound economic dependency on maritime trade, the South China Sea is its soft underbelly. It is a critical existential vulnerability.
A vulnerability to whom, though? The Philippine Coast Guard?
No, a vulnerability to foreign naval forces, specifically the United States Navy. If you look at history, whenever external powers have blockaded or controlled the waters off China's coast, it has resulted in devastating national trauma, what they refer to as a century of humiliation.
Right.
So from the perspective of pure strategic logic, China requires a defensive buffer. It desperately needs a secure approach to its coastline, particularly near vital choke points like the Strait of Malacca, where a blockade could literally starve the country of energy. You call the artificial islands coercive. The counter perspective is that they are vital early warning systems. They are defensive outposts designed to prevent military containment by external powers who patrol thousands of miles away from their own borders.
I understand the desire for a security buffer, truly, but the flaw in that logic is that China's buffer is being built in someone else's front yard. You're treating the sovereignty of smaller nations, their legal right to fish in their own waters and access their own resources as totally acceptable collateral damage for great power security paranoia.
I wouldn't call it paranoia. I'd call it historical realism.
Regardless, this dynamic naturally explains why this isn't just a regional issue anymore. It pulls us into the role of external actors. If you're listening to this, you might be wondering why the United States, Japan, Australia, or India care so deeply about a sandbar off the coast of Palawan.
Right, it's the internationalization of the conflict.
Precisely, because 1/3 of global trade flows through here. The global community has a vested existential interest in ensuring these waters remain international commons, not domestic lakes. This is exactly why the United States, alongside allied navies, conducts freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs.
By sailing heavily armed guided missile destroyers right through the contested waters.
Yes, deliberately sailing warships within the 12 nautical mile zone of these artificial islands. And we really need to explain the mechanics of a FONOP because it is widely misunderstood. It is not an act of war. It is a vital legal enforcement mechanism.
Okay, how so?
Think of customary international law like a driveway. If your neighbor starts parking his car in your driveway and you don't complain for 10 years, eventually the law might recognize that space as his parking spot through adverse possession.
Right, you lose the claim if you don't defend it.
Exactly. In international law, if you do not physically challenge an excessive maritime claim, over time the international community might implicitly recognize it as legitimate. FONOPs are the legal complaint. They demonstrate physically that the world does not recognize these artificial islands as sovereign territory. Without these operations, our dossier points out, we slip into gradual strategic dominance. This is where a major power solidifies de facto control without firing a single shot, simply by bullying smaller neighbors into submission and quietly rewriting the rules of the ocean.
That driveway metaphor is clean. But let's look at the incredibly dangerous physics of what you are actually describing. You are arguing that sailing heavily armed warships, vessels loaded with Tomahawk missiles representing a competing global superpower into a highly sensitive, historically contested basin is a stabilizing action.
I am.
I would argue it does the exact opposite. When external actors conduct FONOPs, they instantly elevate the dispute. What could be a regional disagreement over fishing rights and overlapping sandbars suddenly becomes a high-stakes strategic rivalry between nuclear-armed powers.
But if the U.S. Navy doesn't sail through those waters, the rules-based order folds. The smaller nations simply don't have the naval capacity to push back alone.
The problem is that the rules-based order, when it is enforced at the barrel of a foreign navy's gun, looks an awful lot like aggressive military containment to the nation being circled.
I see how it could be perceived that way, but
By intervening this way, external powers are actively pushing the region toward what our dossier calls military escalation. It turns a localized geographic issue into a proxy battleground over global hegemony. Just look at the diplomatic efforts on the ground. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has been trying for years to negotiate a binding code of conduct with China to manage these waters peacefully.
and those negotiations have been continuously stalled, largely because China refuses to make the code legally binding in a way that actually restrains its actions.
Well, they are hindered precisely because external pressures turn the sea into a geopolitical flashpoint. It is incredibly difficult for regional actors to find a pragmatic, localized diplomatic compromise when every rock and reef is being treated by Washington and Beijing as the front line of the next Cold War. If the external actors backed away, the logic of geographic proximity and economic interdependence would force a localized equilibrium.
But that equilibrium would just be the largest power dictating the terms of surrender to everyone else.
It would be an equilibrium rooted in the actual organic balance of power and the historical reality of the region, rather than an artificially imposed legal framework that requires foreign gunboats to maintain the illusion of compliance.
Look, we've covered an immense amount of ground here today, from the dredging of coral reefs to the intricacies of maritime law. Let's zoom out and look at what this all means.
Yeah, let's summarize.
My position remains that this dispute is the ultimate test case for the necessity of standardized, codified legal frameworks. UNCLOS is certainly not perfect, and yes, it was drafted in a specific historical context, but it is the only viable shield that smaller states have against unilateral coercion.
Right.
If a nation can simply point to a 1947 map, back it up with a massive military buildup and successfully overwrite codified international law, then a terrifying precedent is set.
And to summarize the opposing perspective, I'd say we have to recognize the limits of our legal frameworks.
A legal system designed to standardize state behavior will always fracture when it fundamentally attempts to erase the deeply entrenched historical rights and vital security architectures of a major global power. You simply cannot engineer a mid-20th century treaty to overwrite a millennium of civilizational presence. As long as the modern legal framework refuses to acknowledge the legitimate, historical, and strategic realities of the region, including the genuine fear of external naval containment, it will remain an unenforceable ideal, and the physical friction on the water will only continue to escalate.
What strikes me most from our dossier today is the tragic irony at the heart of this entire conflict. Both sides operate within totally incompatible conceptual systems, meaning the very tools they use to seek security are making them fundamentally less secure.
Absolutely. We aren't just arguing over the interpretation of Article 121 of UN Close or the exact coordinates of the 9-dash line. We are looking at two completely different languages of statecraft.
Right.
If you accept the historical logic, you inherently invalidate the modern legal framework. If you strictly enforce the modern legal framework, you inherently criminalize the historical reality. The tragic irony is that the law meant to prevent war might be the exact trigger for one, while the invocation of ancient historical pride is physically destroying the natural reef environments it claims to cherish.
It is a profound structural impasse. And that leaves us with a stark reality to contemplate. The core dilemma of the South China Sea is not merely about who gets to fish in the Scarborough Shoal or who gets to extract natural gas from the Spratlys. It isn't even just about who controls the physical waters.
No, it's bigger than that.
The real dilemma is which abstract logic, the organic weight of history, or the standardized geometry of law will ultimately govern the future of international relations. We are watching the architecture of the next century being built or dismantled, one dredged reef at a time. The property line is still being contested, and the listener is left to weigh whether the world needs a stronger fence or a deeper understanding of the ground it is built on. We've reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs. See you next time.